Hello, this is the Relational Model, Module 3 of COP4708, Lecture 2, Determinants and Keys. And now's where we're going to get to some more interesting stuff. If you've watched Lecture 1, you learned about tables. Pretty straightforward stuff. Now, let's learn about concept. Okay, we've talked about attributes and entities. And entities, something that you want to describe, in this case of databases. And it has a number of attributes. Okay, well, one of the things that we're going to be doing with databases is we're going to be retrieving records. We're going to be able to find them and retrieve them and get all the attributes. So if we want all the information on a student, we should be able to just take some sort of information about the student and hunt this down pretty easily. So in the organizational scheme, it should make perfectly sense that we have something that identifies the entity. Okay, or we could call this a determinant. Now, I'm not going to use the determinant other than this lecture ever again. I'm going to use the term primary key. Okay, that's what we call it in the database world. Stick with that. But it determines the entity. Now, let's look a little bit further into that one. So, for example, we have here a record. And one of the columns of the record is student ID. It's unique. If you know the student ID, you can find the other information about the student. We wouldn't necessarily use the first name. There can be other people named John. We wouldn't necessarily use the street address, the city, or the state, or the zip code. Those would make no sense. Okay, now a key can be a single record. A key can be multiple records, like two records together. We could say it might be better, instead of saying, if we didn't have a student ID, to use the first name and the last name. But there could be other people named John Doe. Okay, the key needs to be unique. Okay, so student ID would be a better choice for that key. Okay, but realize that you can have a key that is one column, a key that uses multiple columns. I tend to shy away from using the concept of composite keys. It really does make your queries pretty messy. And in the long run, we're going to be using SQL to actually do these queries. Don't worry about that SQL just yet. When you get there, queries in SQL, they're pretty easy to do. So, candidate keys. Okay, a candidate key can be, like, let's say, email. The email for this person should be unique, as should the social security number. Those are candidate keys because, being unique, they do determine the values of all the other columns in the row, in the relation. Okay. However, you may not want to use those as your primary key. We deal with, in database tables, we deal with each row having a single, one primary key. There's only one primary key. It could be a composite key. You could say, hey, let's use email and a social security number together, and that would really make it unique. Okay, but you really want to have something that's simple and easy to use as your primary key. Okay, and when you use the primary key for one table, you don't use it as the primary key for another table. You'll see a reason why we don't do that here in the future, even though there are some databases that let you get around this type of rule. However, we really do want to keep that primary key unique. Okay, so in the case of this, we create a concept of a student ID. Now, in this case, it's a surrogate key. What we really mean is that the database makes this up. It's usually numeric. It's usually completely artificial. There's nothing special about this specific number for student ID. The database assigns it, and the database makes sure that it's unique. We typically don't use it anywhere. I tend to use just the column name ID. when I don't need to really, in this case, student ID makes sense because you're actually got a table that's students. If the table's name is blah, then you can have blah ID as the name of it. Just kind of like to stick to a naming convention for that. But really, the concept of blah ID has no meaning outside the fact that it's being used as a key, primary key for the table. But in this case, it's also called surrogate key. We're not going to call it a surrogate key from here on out. I'm not going to use the term surrogate anymore. I'm just going to say primary key, and you can easily make a determination by looking at the table that, oh, that's automatically generated by the database. Okay, and you're going to see how we do that later on, and those pieces are going to kind of start falling into place. Why not use some of these other ones there? Well, email. Emails, people have like really bizarre emails. And one of the things is that people change their email addresses. So using an email as a primary key, that's kind of a mess, especially if the person wants to change their email address. Social security number, don't use your social security number for anything if you don't have to. Don't give it out. That's a good way to say, hey, here's my identity. Go ahead and take it and use it. Now, how do these keys work together? And this is probably the most important piece of what makes relational databases, and it's the concept of a foreign key. And I am going to use the term foreign key. Primary key and foreign key you're going to hear me use all the time. Okay, a foreign key. One, the foreign key is a primary key of a table. Okay? Just realize, if something is a primary key in one table, it's a candidate for a foreign key in another table. Okay, makes sense? Just remember that. Now, how does this work? Well, if you look at an example, it's going to make perfect sense. You have a student ID, and I have another table called course, and I have a course ID. Now, if I want to enroll you in a course, what I can do is I can take your student ID, I can go to the course table, and then I can put the field for your student ID into that course. And actually what I would do is I'd put it into what's called a course enrollment. I wouldn't actually do it the way it's shown in this example. However, the example does help get the idea of a foreign key and the relation pretty simple. So what are the two ways that I can make this work? I could say in the student table, go ahead and put the course ID, but in that case, you'd only ever be able to register for a single course, unless you had columns for course 1, course 2, course 3, course 4, course 5. Not super flexible. In this table, the course ID, okay, look at this. I got the course name, course number, time, date, semester, da, da, da. Okay, but by putting your student ID in there, I can say, I have now enrolled you in this course. Reality is not the best way to do it. Haha. You're going to look at this in your homework. What would be the best way to do this? And the reason is because, one, I'm going to have to reproduce the course, that whole course thing, that course table every single time I enroll a student in it. I'm going to have a totally another row into that course table. But the concept is there. So, referential integrity. What we do is, and referential integrity is what keeps your database from getting messed up. Okay, it says if something is used as a foreign key in a table, it has to be a primary key in the table that you're looking at. So what it does is it limits the foreign keys that can be used in a table. In other words, I can't enroll a student that doesn't exist in another table. And the database manages this. It keeps you from doing it. It won't let you put that value there if it doesn't exist. That's actually good. So this has a couple of other meanings though. And here's something that you got to think about. Okay, let's go back up to this table. And these are items for thought. And you're going to think about them in your homework. If you enroll a student in the course, so we have a student enrollment, and I'm going to give you these are hints. Really, we want an entity to be a course, student to be an entity, a course to be an entity, and a student enrollment to be a third entity. Okay, listen to what I just said. We want the student to be an entity, a course to be an entity, and a course enrollment to be a third entity. And that third entity, we should identify the course a student's enrolled in and the student that's enrolled in this. Now, referential integrity says, okay, but if I put the student into a course enrollment, if I delete the student, I now have violated my referential integrity because I now have a course enrollment that has a student that doesn't exist. That's bad. You can't have a course enrollment with a student that doesn't exist. How do we deal with that? We do have a way to deal with that. And really it boils down to, do you ever really delete the data? Or maybe we can just say the student is inactive, or we even put a field that says is deleted. And only show students when you look at real students that are active or not deleted. But the record's still there. Now, this should bring about one other thing that you should think about in databases. Do we ever really delete the data? In fact, the reality is most of the time in databases, you don't delete the data unless it's just simply bad data. You need to get rid of it because you're going to put good data in. You will have questions. You're going to have questions because I'm going to ask you ways of dealing with some of these things before you get to the next lecture series, which should be food for thought. Thank you very much and hope you enjoyed this lecture. Primary key, foreign key. These are critical. You will need to know them. They are really the key, no pun intended, to relational databases.